Today is October 6, 2015. I'm Adrienne Falaise, and it is my honor to be interviewing Darren Star for the Archive of American Television here in New York City. Thanks so much for joining us today, Darren.
I'm happy to be here.
So we'd like to take just a few minutes and get some background information.
Okay.
So what was your name at birth?
Darren Star.
Do you have a middle name?
Bennett, Darren Bennett Star.
Excellent. When and where were you born?
I was born at Homestead Air Force Base near Miami, Florida.
And did you grow up there as well?
No, I was just there for my first a year. My dad was stationed there in the Air Force. And then I grew up in Maryland, Bethesda, and Potomac, Maryland, right outside of Washington, D.C.
Great. What are your parents' names and what do they do for a living?
My parents' names are Deborah and Milton, and my father was an orthodontist, retired now, and my mother was a writer. She wrote for the Washington Post and a lot of feature stories for different magazines, and she actually when we were in junior high, she went back to school and got a journalism degree and started her professional career, sort of when her kids were in school.
So how many siblings do you have?
I have a brother and a sister, Bonnie and Mark. Bonnie is a year younger than me, and Mark is almost 9 years younger than me.
What traits do you think you inherited from your parents?
Wow, let's see. I definitely inherited a love of books and writing and the arts from my mother, and I think her sense of humor. And both of my parents have really good senses of humor, actually. And my dad is very, he's a really level-headed guy, and really very intelligent, analytical, and kind, and just, and I think that, and you know, he's kind of wise, as you want your dad to be. And I think that I have like, my dad's got an evenness, and I think I have a little bit of both in me.
Mm-hmm. What were some of your interests when you were growing up?
My number one interest was film and television. I just loved, I love movies, I love TV.
What were you watching?
I loved science fiction. What was I watching? As a kid, of course, I watched The Brady Bunch. And I loved every movie I could see. There wasn't a movie I didn't love. You know, when you're a kid, it's like just to be able to go to the movies was special. Mm-hmm. And I remember seeing movies when they came onto television, like when I was, you know, I don't know how old I was, maybe 12, and like The Graduate was airing on television. It was a really big deal. And, you know, it's hard to imagine that time, sort of back in the 70s, when there was no other way to sort of watch a movie unless you went to a revival house. Once a movie played in the theaters, that was it. There was, you know, it was sort of before video rentals and all that sort of stuff. So seeing movies on television was a really big deal. The event when movies got broadcast on television, even though they were edited for television, it was still a big deal that you'd get a chance as a kid to see that movie that you probably weren't able to ever go to the movie theaters to see. But I love movies. I worked as an usher in a movie theater when I was in high school. I love television. I mean, Bewitched and reruns. I love that. I mean, and as I was a little older, I loved, you know, all the classic shows: Mary Tyler Moore, All in the Family, MASH. You know, so I definitely was a real child of television and film.
Did you know what you wanted to be when you grew up?
You know, when I was younger, I loved acting, but I really didn't want to be an actor. I really wanted to be at first I thought I really just wanted to be a writer and a director. That was sort of a passion of mine. Even when I was like in junior high and high school, I made films. I was really a film geek, and it was sort of the rise of the blockbusters with Steven Spielberg and everything, and I was very obsessed with Steven Spielberg's career, and I just, you know, I had my Super 8 camera and I made films, and I just, you know, in a way I think it was something that I'm sure my parents thought was a hobby that I would grow out of, but then I went to California to go to school, and it was something that I just really wanted to, I just sort of knew in my heart that's what I wanted to do. from a really young age.
So you said you came out to California for school?
Yes, I came out to California school. I went to USC for a year and didn't get into the film school at USC. So then I transferred to UCLA, which was in a much nicer neighborhood. And it was a much better school. Actually, when you go to USC, coming from like Washington, D.C., the sort of fantasy of California was not USC. You know, this sort of school in the middle of grimy downtown. And I was there for the film school, and after a year of sort of, it was great to be there and be exposed to the amount of movies I saw at USC as a freshman was like probably more movies in that 1 year than I'd seen, in my entire life up to that point, because there was just so much access to cinema at USC. But I was a theater major my first year, and I didn't want to stay a theater major, and I didn't want to stay at USC if I wasn't going to be, really a film major. So I transferred to UCLA my sophomore year, and I loved UCLA. I mean, I had a really great experience at UCLA.
So were you focusing on writing there, or what were you working on?
I was an English creative writing major. I always, and applying to film school every year, took all the film classes. Actually took the entire film curriculum at UCLA. I was the orientation counselor for film and TV students at UCLA, but I was never actually officially admitted into the department. They got so annoyed with me having kind of circumvented the rules and taken all the classes that they wouldn't officially admit me. But I did sort of take the whole curriculum and had great instructors there, like Lou Hunter and some really well-known people at that school. And I had a really wonderful writing instructor by the name of Brian Moore, who was a fiction writing instructor. He's an Irish novelist. He's passed away, but wrote really wonderful novels like The Lonely Passion of Judith Hearn, and he wrote Torn Curtain, the Alfred Hitchcock movie, and a number of books in the 80s that actually, some I can't remember right offhand, but some that were also made into movies. And he was this really sort of tough Irish guy who was, I remember, best friends with Joan Didion and John Gregory Dunn, and I was so impressed by that whole his whole world and sort of and his creative output, and I took his creative writing class for a number of years, and he was very encouraging of me in terms of my, as a writer. And I kind of think that was a really kind of just key experience in terms of my time at UCLA, to sort of get that kind of support and encouragement from someone whose work I really respected. And he said to me, I remember he pulled me aside, after class once, and it was a fiction writing class. It really wasn't, it wasn't a screenwriting class, but I think my stories tended to be fairly humorous and a lot of dialogue. And he said, you should really be a television and film writer. You should be a screenwriter. You should be writing for television. He's like, you can really do this. And to hear that when you're in college, it was just a really wonderful affirmation of a path that certainly my parents thought was crazy. There was nobody in my family that was in the entertainment business, and so there wasn't a really, there wasn't sort of a path to follow in a sense.
Right. So were you doing student films then in school?
I was doing student films. I did my project 1 at UCLA, and but I sort of was encouraged to do the master's screenwriting program, but I was very impatient, which is one of my qualities that I am still working on. And that sense of impatience, I kind of graduated and thought, I'd rather be waiting tables and writing than staying in school another year.
So is that what you did?
Which is what I did, yes. Yes.
So did you have an industry job right away then, or?
My first industry job, which I think is an industry job because so many people in the industry have this job, is I was a waiter at Hamburger Hamlet in Brentwood. And it was actually, coming out of college, that was sort of that's the job I really wanted. I had this fantasy that I would be waiting tables and, at night, and writing during the day. And in fact, I think I was waiting tables and goofing off for the most part, and I realized, okay, I have to like somehow find a job in the industry. And UCLA had, and I'm sure they still have, this job board for students. And there was a job posting for an assistant at an entertainment PR firm, Gutman and Pam. And these guys represented, like, at the time in the 80s, this was around 1984, everybody in the business. They were sort of like, there was sort of Rogers and Cowan and Gutman and Pam, and it was like Christopher Reeve and Gene Hackman and Sean Connery and Kathleen Turner during Romancing the Stone. And, I interviewed with a woman named Susan Geller, who became my boss, who hired me. And in fact, I credit her in a big way she was really instrumental in starting my career because she hired me. And while I was working there at Gutman and Pam, I was writing sort of TV pilots and screenplays, and she passed on my work to two young producers, Andy Licht and Jeff Mueller, who had a producing deal at Warner Brothers, and they engaged me to sort of develop a treatment with them, which we then sold to Warner Brothers as a feature. So that job was, you just don't know how things are going to play out. First of all, I was thrilled to sort of get my toe in the door of the entertainment industry. And Susan, who was really bright, brash young woman, although she was probably 5 years older than me, and I thought she was like a whole other generation. But in fact, she was just ballsy, and she was probably 28, 29. She represented Kathleen Turner and Molly Ringwald and Dennis Quaid, and she was really tough, and she really knew what she was doing. And I just was around that, and suddenly I was really around had like a peek into the business. And Dick Gutman, it was Dick Gutman and Jerry Pam. It was sort of their shop. Dick was also a writer and a television writer, and in fact, Dick just wrote a book about his memoir, and just a real old Hollywood guy. I mean, Dick is still working. He represents Barbra Streisand, and it was just an old Hollywood, in fact, that doesn't really exist anymore. And to be around these guys who were very open and generous with their time in a way, and to see somebody like Dick, who was writing and selling material, it was just, I think it was kind of like spending many years being on the outside, well, being in school and just imagining what the business is like, to being on the other side and just kind of seeing how the publicity side of the business worked, which was not what I wanted to do, but was really interesting to be a part of. And I wrote all the client bios and press releases and everything. And in fact, the way I got the job was they asked for a sample of my writing, and I wrote a bio of Joan Rivers, who I was a big fan of. And in writing her bio, I attributed all these quotes to her, which were, jokes, Joan Rivers jokes that I basically wrote. So I think it was, the bio itself is like, I would love to dig it out and find it somewhere. But it was, a piece of comedy writing in a way that sort of got me the job. So it was definitely a job where I was able to do a lot of writing, even though it was, just entertainment PR writing. Mm-hmm. But I was, I spent a lot of my time sort of writing, actor, movie star bios, and just kind of filled with unbelievable superlatives.
So how did you go then from working at the PR firm, you're writing some screenplays, and then just a few years later you get tapped to create Beverly Hills 90210?
So when I was working at the PR firm, I was writing, sort of, I was taking UCLA extension classes in screenwriting, and I was just, I just really had my eye on the ball in terms of writing. And Susan Geller put me in touch with Andy and Jeff. Andy Lick and Jeff Miller, who had this producing deal at USC. I mean, at the producing deal at Warner Brothers. They came out of the USC Peter Stark producing program, and were one of these first young guys to get a deal at Warner Brothers. And I developed a screenplay with them based on an idea they had, and it was called Doing Time on Planet Earth. And it was about a kid who's a teenager in a small town who somehow comes to believe that he's actually an extraterrestrial, and because and there's a group of, it was a comedy, sci-fi comedy, and there are a group of people that think they are actually extraterrestrials who are looking for this sort of their sort of leader and a spaceship that's going to take them back to their planet. And this kid who the show is about, I mean the movie's about, his father owns a holiday and manages a Holiday Inn with a revolving restaurant that this group actually thinks may be a spaceship. It was zany, let's put it that way. But I wrote a treatment for it, and we pitched it to Mark Canton. We pitched the movie to Mark Canton, who was at Warner Brothers at the time, and it was my first experience sort of going through a studio gate, and I really was just like thrilled, beyond anything, just to sort of like get an audience with, with Mark Canton. And I was really surprised that, in fact, they hired me to write the screenplay. And it was at a time when people wrote, I don't know that they do it so much now, but I got hired off the treatment. I'd written like sort of a 15-page treatment, and I'd had a script that I'd written for at UCLA, so I'd had a couple writing samples, and they hired me. At the time, actually, because this connects to something that happened later in my career, and I kind of feel like there's so many things that just are just serendipity that you just can't ever plan on. And when people ask me, like, how do you get a job in the business, or how do you get your foot in the door? The answer is honestly, like, I would have no idea. You just sort of have to, I think the number one thing you have to do is be obsessively thinking about it, which is what I was doing. I was obsessively thinking about it, but the chain of events that led to sort of like major events in my career are things that I would have no idea of how those dots connected until I looked back on them later, and I was like, wow. And one of those dots was I left Gutman and Pam because for a short time before I sold this script, and for a few months, for about 6 months maybe at the most, I worked at Showtime to become sort of the assistant to the head of West Coast publicity there. And actually I was sort of like a junior publicist, so it was like kind of a promotion. And I was the worst publicist ever. I was really so uninterested in publicizing anything except, possibly publicizing my own career. So I would just be, I would be, the idea of having to watch these shows that I didn't want to watch, and just, it really was not in my blood to be a publicist, but I was happy to have the job. But Peter Chernin was the president of Showtime at the time, and Showtime was, still fairly fledgling network, and Peter was sort of, he was running the network, but he was still a fairly young guy, and I got to know Peter a little bit, and I left that job when I sold this script, which I think was like a big shock to everybody, because I think they were sort of at one point wondering why they ever hired this young kid to work there to begin with, and the next minute I was like out the door because I'd sold the screenplay, so they were like, what? But when I had the opportunity to sort of meet on 90210, and they were and I'd met Aaron Spelling, and I'll talk about that. The major decision maker at Fox at the time was Peter Chernin, who had to basically give me the blessing to go ahead and write that, to write the pilot.
Mm-hmm. That's serendipity.
That's serendipity. Yeah, you just really have to, I think, in terms of like being a writer in this business, just sort of pursue, first of all, follow your own path and be yourself as much as possible, because that's certainly what I was doing. I mean, I was like, a fairly geeky kid just wanting to like do this so badly, and just having no idea how sort of like the pieces would connect.
Mm-hmm. So tell us about how Beverly Hills 90210 came about.
So Beverly Hills 90210 came about at a time when I had like actually, when I sold Doing Time on Planet Earth, which was, which I sold to Warner Brothers, I was 24, so I was young, and I was like 2 years out of college, so even I was I wasn't prepared to sort of have a sale at that young, but it was a good time to do it because there were a lot of teenage-oriented movies out there in the marketplace, and Shane Black, who I went to UCLA with, had sold Lethal Weapon not too far from then, not around that time. So there were like, I think there was the idea that you gave younger writers a shot, mm-hmm. and the door was open in a sense, and there was some opportunity there. So after I sold the script, I had I got an agent, Steve Rabineau, who actually continues to be my agent today, and I wrote, I wrote screenplays for a lot of the studios. I mean, I did rewrites, and I wrote screenplays, and I did a sort of a big page one rewrite. In fact, I got, I got screenplay credit on it, but it was based on a story written by somebody else I'd gone to school with, a guy named Fred Decker, who wrote a movie called Teen Agent, and Warner Brothers sent it to me to rewrite, and I loved the idea. And it was about a teenager who's mistaken for a spy and goes on this sort of like, it was a James Bond spoof, and I love James Bond films. So I wrote that. I wrote that movie, which got made at Warner Brothers with Richard Grieco, and I was just writing a number of. I was sort of like, a pretty busy working writer in my 20s when I had written a script at TriStar for an executive named Paul Stupin, who then left TriStar and left the position. I thought at the time, damn, this is not going to get made now. And in fact, another executive came in, gave me endless notes, and it seemed like it wasn't going to get made. Didn't get made, but then Paul called me and said, he'd become head of drama at Fox, which was sort of this new network. And I think you have to realize at the time, the idea of being a working screenwriter, fairly in demand, that I was getting jobs, and television is something you just thought you were lucky enough not to be working in television if you were working as a screenwriter. At least that's what I thought. And I think that was sort of the idea at the time, was that there was a hierarchy and movies were here and television was there. But he called me and asked if I was interested in talking to them about developing a TV series about high school in Beverly Hills. They'd mistakenly thought they'd owned they mistakenly thought they owned the rights to Beverly Hills High, which in fact they actually didn't, which is why we were never able to refer to the school as Beverly Hills High. It was always West Beverly. Mm-hmm. In fact, we had to do a lot of gyrations for legal reasons to make sure that the audience understood that we were not doing a show about Beverly Hills High. If you look at the first season of 90210, or first two seasons, there are many references to West Beverly High is playing Beverly Hills High in football next week, just to make clear that this is not Beverly Hills High. It's the fictional West Beverly High. But in any case, I met with Paul and I met with the Fox executives, and they had Aaron Spelling was attached to produce this pilot, and I didn't understand anything about the business, but other than the fact that I was, thrilled beyond anything to meet with Aaron Spelling, and in fact they owed him a pilot commitment because they were going to do Angels 88, which they didn't. I wish they had. I would have liked to have seen that show. Mm-hmm. But, and so they rolled it into this Beverly Hills High show. And I met Aaron at his house. very, he is a charming, avuncular man and a legend. And he met me. I distinctly remember meeting Aaron in his living room, not at the big house he moved into, but sort of the more, still a mansion, but modest by the scale of the next one. And he was wearing like a tracksuit, and we talked about the show. He saw this movie, Doing Time on Planet Earth, which eventually got made. Talk about that story, which is sort of a interesting little episode. And the movie did get made by Charlie Matthau. Walter Matthau's son directed it at Canon Pictures. So I got to work with Menachem Golan back in the day, and he was quite a character. And anyway, that movie took an unexpected journey. It was started as a big budget movie at Warner Brothers and got made eventually as a little low budget movie at Canon. So it didn't turn out the way I'd expected, but Aaron Spelling liked it, and he saw it, and he we had our meeting, and he approved me to write the pilot script. And at the time, Aaron is a marvelous storyteller. I mean, I think for all of Aaron's strengths, I think he just has a really strong sense of the audience and pleasing an audience, and just sort of how to tell a story. So it was really, for me, just an amazing experience to be able to just sit in a room and bounce my ideas off of Aaron. And he was very available. He didn't have a lot. He had a big company, but not a lot in production, not a lot going on. So I think he just I think we both really, I think he enjoyed the experience. And I certainly was enjoying writing the pilot. And then the pilot got made. And at that time, I thought, well, of course the pilot's getting made. It's good. They got to make it. But I didn't realize it was like not a typical experience that, you write a pilot and it gets made. And in fact, it was a 2-hour pilot, so I wrote it like a movie. I should go back to say that when I spoke to the guys at Fox about 90210, I felt a particular ability to write this show because I had written a number of teenage-oriented movies, and I was a big John Hughes fan, and I felt like that the movies were sort of capturing an honesty about the teenage experience, and television was not. And television was so far behind in terms of providing any insight or honesty into what it was like to be a teenager, and that it just needed to catch up. And so I kind of was, when I talked to Fox about the show, I basically said one of the shows that I loved was 30-something, and I said I wanted this to be like 30-something for teenagers, and that 30-something was I thought was very insightful about characters in their 30s, and the stories were small. And I said with 90210, anything that matters to these teenagers is what the story's about. And it's not about parents solving teenagers' problems. It's about teenagers solving their own problems, and in fact, adults should be superfluous. Ironically, when we shot the show, they were so worried about the fact there were so few adults in there that the parents had a lot more to do sort of in those earlier episodes, but and sort of less and less as the series went on, because it was very much about it was about the kids, and it was also about trying to be as I guess just frank, honest, but more like as you could be in television at that time, but just more modern. I mean, television I felt like shows about teenagers were written by much older adults who were basically generally making fun of teenagers. And there hadn't been a show written, and I was still young enough that I had a strong sense of what it was like to be a teenager, and I could really access that. And I just didn't feel there was a show that was relevant about the teenage experience on television. So that's sort of what I talked to them about. And then having written the pilot, we had Tim Hunter was hired to direct it. Sort of a very, well-regarded indie film director. He directed The River's Edge, which was really a terrific movie. He wasn't, he wasn't the funniest guy, but very smart. And then we started we started casting the show, and I think I was really, Aaron was very generous by including me in everything, all the casting, and I felt like I had a lot of authorship over that pilot, in the show as it continued, and but when it's your first time doing something like that, it's all super exciting, and it's just amazing that it was the first time that it turned out to be a show that became such a significant show. I mean, it could have just turned out to be a busted pilot, and it still would have meant the same to me because it was the first thing I had done. So the fact that it was the first time, but it was also casting all these, a cast of characters that the world knows, later on is just kind of like amazing.
Well, tell us a little bit about casting.
Well, I remember I don't know how many stories you guys want.
We want as many as you want to tell.
But one thing I love about Aaron is that he had an office at the beginning, and I'm sure he has basically talked about this in his own talk. But Aaron had an office at Warner Hollywood, which he'd had, I guess, for many years, and that's when I first met him, and he had this office. And around the time, right after I wrote the 90210 pilot, he moved into a very, from these, old Hollywood offices at Warner Hollywood, which was like a studio built in the 20s. And his office was shag carpeting and big crystal bowls and like enormous couch the size of a football field. And the office itself was just gigantic. I mean, like very, very impressive and gigantic, and like a time capsule of the 70s, and very comfortable, with a gigantic bathroom at one end, and it was like the size of a football field. So he moved to these very slick, the whole Spelling Company moved to these very slick offices, which was for a long time the Variety Building on Wilshire Boulevard, and it was very, very modern, and you needed like card keys to get everywhere, and it was all very, steel and glass. And I thought, wow, I wonder how Aaron is going to really adapt to like being in such a, it was 1990, and it was like such a sleek office. And then you walked, you did all the card keys, and you walked into his office, and you walked through the door, and it was literally a replica of his office at Warner Hollywood. Same size, shag carpeting, same couches, same dimensions of the room, like nothing had changed. So that's where we cast 90210. And
do you remember who was cast first?
I remember Shannon being cast very early on. But then we had a really hard time casting Jason Priestley. And it was really just a few days before we going to start production, and we'd brought some other actors to Fox. Thank God we didn't cast them, because without the right actors, you don't have a show. I mean, there's so much luck that's involved in a hit show. You just need the right combination of the right actors who also happen to be available. Because it's like, who's available, and like I just remember Peter Chernin was like, no, these guys are. We'd go to the network, and we had some ideas, and they're like, nope, they're not approved, and come back, and we were like, oh my God, we gotta find, it was like almost like a Friday, we're gonna start shooting on Monday. And then Jason Priestley came in, and he was on another show, Sister Kate. And I think that it was on NBC, and I think they basically said guaranteed they wouldn't be renewing it. So we brought him in, and I remember he read with Shannon, and he was great. And Jason, and we asked Shannon, do you like him? And she's like, yeah, I really like him. And then he got approved, and we started shooting. But it was very much down to the wire in terms of casting.
And Tori had auditioned under a different name?
So my experience with the Tori Spelling story was I never she may have auditioned, but the part she auditioned for was literally girl number 2. So girl number 2 was Tori Spelling, and I thought, that's fine. You know, it's great. It's Aaron's daughter. It's like she was in high school. She had maybe one or two lines in the pilot. She was never written by me as a series regular until Aaron said, okay, Tori is now going to be in the show. And I thought, okay, I have to give girl number 2 a name. So she became Donna. And I have to say, I don't know that, I'm sure Tori auditioned for the 2-line role, but Tori was from the beginning the most professional actress on the show. She was like, she showed up before a call. I think she was like very aware that she in some ways was handed the part, but wanted to earn her way into the role, which I really believe she did over the course of the series. She became like the star. She became like one of the major stars of the show. But it was, you know, as you know, the writers wrote for her, you know, little by little, sort of through her stuff to see what she could do, because it wasn't a fully created character. From the beginning, it was a character that we kind of created around Tori.
So tell us just quickly a little bit, if you remember the casting stories for Jenny Garth as Kelly.
I remember Jenny being so adorable, and I was so green in terms of these readings that she literally, I was really charmed by her. And she read the lines at the network, and one of her lines was, that I'd written in the script was like, you know, just waving hi to somebody, and she did it, and she waved hi, and for some reason I thought she was waving hi to me, so in the middle of her audition, I waved back and said hi, and I realized, oh, she's doing the script. But she was, no, she was just like, I just remember her coming in and just nailing it. She was just really, you know, charming and lovely.
Gabrielle Carteris.
Gabrielle, you know, that part was very much based on a friend of mine whose name was Andrea King, who's in fact a writer, and someone I went to high school with, and she ended up coming to LA, and she's a screenwriter, television writer. Yeah, I just remember, you know, Gabrielle felt like that, you know, she felt like she had the DNA of what I imagined that role to be. I was so green. I just thought everybody was the age they were portraying in the show. So it took me a while before I realized that these weren't all teenagers that we cast. I mean, that Gabrielle, in fact, was my age. I was like super shocked about that. Because I just bought into the whole idea that they were teenagers.
Ian Ziering as Steve Sanders.
What's that?
Ian Ziering.
Yeah, Ian just came in and was just, you know, funny and was just that, like, in a way, I think he's like just like kind of a goofy jock, and he just kind of nailed that, and I think he was literally about to sort of quit the business until he got this role. I mean, I think this was like maybe one of his last auditions in his mind that he was going on, and then he was going back to sort of run his family's aquarium store in New Jersey or something like that. But yeah, Ian and let's see, who else?
Brian Austin Green.
Brian was just I remember Brian reading in Aaron's office, and he was just like this adorable kid, really cute.
And then Luke Perry wasn't in the pilot.
And Luke Perry wasn't in the pilot. I mean, you know, after the first episode, when we sort of got together as writing staff, we were sort of missing sort of a bad boy in a way, or an edgier kind of character. So we created Dylan, and I don't remember reading Luke earlier. I mean, I've read that like he came in to read for another role, but I just remember from me seeing, my recollection of him is when he came in to read for Dylan, and we loved him, and Aaron loved him, and you know, and I think it's very well known that Aaron went out of pocket to sort of like hire him on the show as a series regular. I mean, and the network wasn't necessarily like on board with adding a series regular. I mean, Aaron really understood the DNA of what makes shows work, and I think he knew that we needed this kind of character in the show, And he loved, and of course, Luke was fantastic.
So tell us a little bit about the writing on 90210. What was the writer's room like, coming up with storylines?
So for me, it was a bit of a shock going from like someone who sat in a room myself and wrote the screenplay to suddenly realizing there were other writers involved. And I had never run a show before, and Chuck Rosen, who actually had never run a show before either, but had a lot more experience in television for years than I had, was brought in as the showrunner. And we had like just a small writing staff, and it was just coming up and sitting in a room and doing what writing staffs do, and talking about ideas and storylines. And it was very. I remember the first script written by Amy Spees that I read. That was not. It was the first script written by a staff writer, and it was really. It was really interesting and I don't want to say surprising, but it was a strange experience, I guess, to see somebody else write characters I created, and realize that, okay, other writers are going to be writing this show, but then also being incredibly grateful for the idea that other writers were going to be writing this show, and like being like just like amazed at what other people were bringing to it, and seeing the show sort of grow as this organic thing. And see, I mean, the wonderful thing about 90210 is it's ultimately about everybody's high school experience, and high school is such a universal thing. And the idea of high school and friendship and I think everyone has something to contribute, and an understanding of that. And it was really interesting to sort of see that, to see the show develop organically as people brought in their high school experiences and the specificity of those experiences, which is, I mean, the writing room experience the first year of 90210 was something that, like, I think so much of that now is like, I think for me, like when you're, I was fairly young. I mean, I was like 29, and but I think it was so intense suddenly being thrown into the water and saying swim, that I don't even have like I don't even remember so many of the details. I think it's like kind of being like when you're, like those sort of memories when you're in preschool. It's like you just. I think there was like so much intensity about the experience, and I mean there were moments that there's so much I remember with a lot of clarity, but I remember that I hadn't experienced this kind of intensity before, being a writer who was used to making my own hours and being a fairly irresponsible and lucky kid. And if I haven't mentioned the word lucky a million times in this interview, let me mention it now, because so much, I gotta say, so much of my career, I think everybody's career in this business that succeeds is like, you have to have luck. And I look back and see the luck that I've, certainly a lot of luck that I've had. But at the time I was like I was having a fairly successful career in my 20s as a screenwriter, being able to make my own hours, and had more money than my friends because I was getting paid to write scripts, and I, was like, for me, felt like, wow, I'm like living large. And suddenly I was very accountable, and I think I think it was like a real growing experience for me. I remember like showing up late to casting sessions with Darren, because I just had a very sort of like, loose idea of time. I wasn't like, I was on my own sort of creative time. But once the show started, that really changed. And I think, running a TV show, producing a TV show is like, a military enterprise. And I sort of got with the program fairly quickly. And I remember Aaron had his sort of partner, Duke Vincent, who, wonderful guy who basically ran Aaron's business and production, and sort of did the nuts and bolts producing. And he was also a former Blue Angel. but he literally was somebody like straight out of the Rat Pack, like, and I'm sure he was friends with those guys. But it's like you could have been sitting in a room with Dean Martin when you were with Duke, and I again had like a loose idea of like the time schedules about getting scripts done, and I remember there was a script that I was writing, one of the first few scripts, and it was maybe in prep, and I just thought, well, it doesn't actually film until X date, and I thought that was my deadline, and I was, just I'll get to it, I'll get around to it, and then I got a call from Duke, basically hollering like, "Where's that script?" And I'm like, "It's not quite. I'm working on it." He goes, he basically hit the ceiling and explained, basically read the riot act to me and explained how it worked. And I think from then I sort of got with the program and I understood like deadlines in terms of, and the sort of discipline you need to create television every week.
Great. Let's take a short break.
Sure.